Hello, welcome to History 102 Zoom class. We are on week 9 and we're doing the Roaring Twenties. And notice instead of argumentative sections, the format is a little different this time, right? And that I ask you to do at least a one-page write-up and to do the research independently. Okay. And with that research, um, it's just one of the 5 questions of your choice. And just please read the introduction, okay, to the Roaring Twenties. I tried to give kind of a popular old basic narrative, right, of the 20s, and oftentimes, right, it is clouded with the in hindsight as connected to the Great Depression, right? A very popular historical narrative runs, right, that the Roaring Twenties was a decade of excess. Okay, was a decade of excess, and because what they're doing is they're kind of setting up a cautionary tale, right? That things went a little too far, and indirectly or directly led to the Great Depression. All right, so you got to keep that in mind. Also, in doing the 20s, is connected to the Great Depression. You'll find the Keynesian, it's called John Maynard Keynes Keynesian interpretation to the Great Depression. That basically, I want to save that for next week, but it basically or for the next topic, it saves most of the criticism for the government, for in particular, the policies under Andrew Mellon. But now we're going to focus right on a lot of the uh, things that pertain to what they called the culture war, right? And the culture war was just, generically speaking, was fought concerning those who were embracing the changes of the 1920s and those who were lamenting those changes, right? And wanting to retain or even go back to the good old days of whatever they thought was or constituted Americana. And so we're looking at the culture war here largely during the 1920s. Okay. Let me count my names and make sure that I have you all accounted for. Great. All right. So I have you accounted for. Now on sharing the screen, I want to go over this right here. All right. So notice your questions from which you choose. Okay. I ask you to choose, please. Number 1, to whatever extent it was accurate, what factors do you believe may have contributed to women's empowerment, liberation, or defiance of Victorian norms? Okay, that's number 1 from which you can choose. All right, and so let me know if you have any questions as far as what I'm asking on that. Um, their empowerment, their liberation, those seem to be pretty self-explanatory. Defiance of Victorian norms. Victorian norms, right, greatly held to the idea, right, of the innate difference between men and women. It was known as the cult of domesticity, right? Women are innately, inherently, by God's will, right, to be different from men. They are more fragile, less independent, less practically inclined. Um, they are, however, more emotional. They're more compassionate and soft-hearted, and they are more virtuous than men. And so legislation would follow suit with that cultural what they held to be an axiom that you don't question for centuries, right? I mean, my goodness, I couldn't begin to know how far this goes back. You think of the Roman paterfamilias, the king of his own castle back in Rome, in the form of the husband and father. The Germanic tribes, in some ways, were more egalitarian and democratic than Rome, but not that much. They were still patriarchal, and through the medieval and early modern period, colonial period, etc. Right? Remember, they also had a system called coverture, whereby the woman's her property, her identity, her self-preservation under the law, um, all went under the wings of her husband once she married him. Right? He represented her. and everything of hers became his, etc. And so very, very hardcore patriarchal tradition we have, right? So with the Victorian era, and that at least one manner, because I'm certainly no expert on the Victorian era, they prolonged, they continued a lot of those assumptions, whereby women were supposed to, not even within marriage, were they to even uh, feign or display any sexual proclivities, even with their own husband. Um, and They were to be just show propriety and class and elegance, self-restraint, right? Virtue, but also, sadly, submissiveness to their husbands, etc., right? And accept their separate role in society. So, by and large, perhaps you think of like the flapper, right, during the 1920s, the image of this new woman. That was an expression made by a Russian woman who got herself in trouble in Bolshevik Russia, but using that term, right, that this new woman would no longer be submissive. She would no longer be docile and obedient, but that she would be the arbiter of her own destiny, that she would be even defiant and strong and willful and even ambitious, and pursue her own ambitions, etc. in life. So it was very much in many ways, right, a protest to, a defiance of traditional patriarchy and the Victorian age. Okay, so what may have led to that? What may have facilitated that, right? And so I'd like you to do research, and of course, especially under COVID, you could just use, and please cite a an online source. You don't have to use a hard book. Okay. So then the second option, to what extent did the Harlem Renaissance earn popular or institutional respect? And of course, what I mean, right, as the Harlem Renaissance as being in particular uh, emblematic of and emanating from the African American community, right? So popular or institutional respect, I mean that institutionally with the government and those who are leading the institutions, the media, public schools, etc., right? And or just socially, right? Just white people in general, non-Black Americans. So to what extent did they earn institutional respect, tolerance, or inclusion, right? A word they oftentimes use for inclusion, Martin Luther King, etc., is integration, right? They want to be integrated, joined in with white society. So to what extent were they successful via the Harlem Renaissance? All right, that's your second option. Number three, and I didn't dig very deep here, did I, intellectually? Not a very intellectually impressive question, but but I think left up to a lot of subjective thought and independent thought on your own to go whatever direction you want to go. Why do you think prohibition failed? And prohibition, by way of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, prohibited the manufacturing, sales, consumption of an alcoholic beverage. And the Volstead Act specified that it was very low, less than 1% alcohol. And so that was the 18th Amendment. As you might know, it's the only amendment that was directly refuted, right, by way of the 20th Amendment that did away with it. But it prevailed, right, until about 1934. So let's see here. Number four, to what extent were the traditionalists' concerns reasonable or justified? So, as you might guess, in light of the culture war, the traditionalists were the conservatives. They were the ones who wanted to conserve tradition, right? The way things used to be. And they were concerned about these changes during the Roaring Twenties. So, to what extent, right? Because it's very easy. I was trying to be a little bit revisionist here, because especially when we interject our modern world with its norms and values and worldview, it's very easy to just simply discard the traditionalist as being kind of archaic, backward, uh, illiterate country bumpkins who were blind and stubbornly blind to the changes that were inevitably coming. in the world and in this country in particular. So, but to what extent, as far as playing devil's advocate with that standard narrative, and of course you do not have to agree, right? If you were to try to answer number four, it certainly doesn't mean that you're objectively trying to state, right? Okay, what picking and choosing, what seemed to be a justifiable concern. So hence you don't have to agree with their all of their concerns, right? So for instance, it comes down to like, you have the variety of exospecies exospecies evolution theory by Darwin being taught in schools. The new woman and this quote, sexual promiscuity that was projected by the press and by sociologists and critical writers of that day. But then you also have, the KKK and their xenophobic concerns about Catholics and Jews and African Americans and immigrants, right? So you certainly, if you were to choose number four, I meant it to be a very selective question. You don't have to be in line with all the facets of the traditional movement, much less either with their projected aims or goals, right? But just simply looking at that which they were concerned about. Then number five, your last option, to what extent did hedonism, living for instant gratification or pleasure, right? To what extent did hedonism or irresponsible decision-making or behavior during the Roaring '20s contribute to the Great Depression? And of course, with number five, I don't pretend on multiple counts, right, as I've already described in class. For one, this is not necessarily a thesis that I believe in. Secondly, I would never pretend that hedonism accounts fully, ought to account fully in a, as far as causation, in a narrative about what caused the Great Depression. So no, like I mentioned with Keynesian thesis, right? Nothing is really inherently connected to number five regarding the Republicans' administrations and their economic policies or lack thereof. Other components to the international global situation with Europe, etc., and lots of other factors that, of course, ought to be included in this narrative. But I'm only giving you, I'm giving you just less than a week. I'm giving you just 6 days to do this. I'm not expecting it to be that, that thorough and nuanced. You just don't have enough time, and especially just asking you to use only one resource, one source. And so I tried to measure it down to this kind of basic narrative that you find of the '20s, right? So at any rate, before I begin, like giving some suggestions about avenues that you may want to take, things you may want to look into, should you choose give this given number. Are there any questions or comments from any of you?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Does our resource that we use need to be a primary source?
No, that's a great question. And for those of you, right, a bit new to history, primary source comes from the time period itself, right? So in the form of letters, speeches, written correspondence, right? Those types of things that come from the '20s. That would be pretty awesome if you could throw in a quote, some kind of primary source, but absolutely it is not required on this, just a bit, kind of minor scale assignment that I'm giving you just for the week. So that's a great question. No, to be honest, I should have specified that, but I was assuming that it would primarily, from many of you, be a secondary source. And a secondary source, right, is a book that's written today, right? Outside that chronological period of being studied by a contemporary historian who uses primary sources, right, to support his or her claims. That's a great question, though, Grace. Anyone else? All right.
I can't remember if you mentioned if we have pre-made readings to go along with this.
Let's see here. Let me get my my textbook here. Sorry about that. So by all means, take a look at the chapter, at our textbook. All right. And notice on my announcement and on the assignment itself, I do say that I would prefer and love for you to utilize one source in addition to the textbook, but I'm not formally requiring it. But by all means, I would very much suggest that you do such, that you look into the textbook first. It's a great kind of macro view of everything, giving you the basic facts on these different subtopics rather well. So Alan Brinkley's textbook, it's chapter 22, The New Era. All right. Any other questions? Those are good questions. All right. Feel free to raise your hand or even just verbally chime in, okay, as I go along here. I'm going to go back to this page here. So, women's empowerment, right? So to what extent, as far as causation goes, right? To what extent were they facilitated by political progress, this liberation of the women of the 1920s? So, and like I said, these are all really just suggestions, just to get your, I have to assume that at least one person in every class has had a very minimal exposure to U.S. history. Okay. So I'm just throwing things out there that you may or may not already be aware of. Just to me, I would rather give you too much than too little, but I am not expecting you to cover all the stuff that I write down, or even any of it for that matter, as long as you show some relevant, logically relevant data. Okay. And even subtopics for that matter. So I'm just throwing these out there, just food for thought. Okay. Political empowerment. You have the antebellum movements or the women's clubs, right? Fighting against slavery, against alcohol, against domestic abuse, for prison reform, against child labor, etc. Right? A lot of those reforms will be revitalized during the Progressive Era. Really gained steam in the 1890s and the first decade of the 1900s. So you have different reformers, right? The women that did the Seneca Falls Convention, right? Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, right? And their Seneca Falls Convention with their Declaration of Sentiments declaring the rights of women, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence and its rhetoric of the social contract and human equality, right? And natural rights for all humans. In the progressive movement, right, Frances Willard headed the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I put her down because it was the largest organization filled with women reformers fighting for alcohol temperance, right? Carrie Chapman Catt was a big spokesman for a myriad of different movements, including women's suffrage. She's an interesting figure and was rather instrumental in forcing discourse about this, right? Forcing the male population to confront the issue of women's rights and to take it on, even if it were in opposition, to no longer just keep it under the table, all right? And then the 19th Amendment gave suffrage to women. And of course, right, in its practical application, it was a whole other deal rather than just on paper for women of color, especially Black women, obviously, living in the Jim Crow states and the failure of Reconstruction and everything, right? And the way they circumvented or went around the 15th Amendment. So at any rate, let's see here for Black men as well. Alice Paul, very, very confrontational, what you're going to find later in the civil rights movement, direct action stuff, right? As far, no longer just speeches and parades, petitions to state legislators and to Congress, right? Written petitions with signatures. they became more direct, and having strikes and boycotts and public fasts, and other symbols that were very just much more confrontational, for lack of a better adjective, right? So the suffragettes, they secured that by 1920. Okay, so now women have the right to vote. So to some people, right, and of course not all, they might say, okay, this is definitely relevant to the liberation of women. The political foundation is being, formed beneath their feet, metaphorically, right? Then economic and academic progress may be things you could possibly look into. So the growth of a new middle class that became rather affluent by the 1890s and able to buy household appliances, and then the availability of bakeries and laundries, etc. Right? Supposedly, this gave white middle class women leisure time and extra money. Urbanization. A lot of Americans, including women, moved to the cities. America technically had become an urban nation by 1920, by the 1920s. And so within those cities, you have many more employment opportunities. The cost of living is higher, so you almost need to have a job. And then you have the availability of products. So we went over that in our Gilded Age assignment, right? With mass production, interchangeable parts, the whole conveyor belt stuff, right? And having things moved where you streamline production and you greatly enhance your efficiency, right? And how quickly and how much in bulk you can produce. Henry Ford is an example of that, right, in the 1920s. And so with that, right, is that empowering women to have more time on their hands, to have more money in their pockets. And not to mention, I didn't mention anything on this list about victories in the courts, right? They have books on that and sources on that. Just a nice narrative of increasing rights and opportunities granted to women by precedent in the courts in the 1800s. And then, of course, I mentioned that young lady Rahel Golub, the immigrant girl who receives now publicity with her writings, her autobiographical writings of her experience as a German Jewish immigrant girl in a man's patriarchal world, back at home, and then back here in the United States as well. But now having some time to earn an independent salary, being able to interact with other young unmarried women in the factory, at work. And not to mention, most women by the 1920s received jobs that were still considered pink collar, that were still considered, female oriented as far as the whole separate spheres paradigm goes. So like clerical jobs, answering telephones, right? And doing work as a secretary, working as nurses, working as elementary school teachers, especially with the settlement house movement, making that so popular for young women during the progressive era, right before the 20s. And so at any rate, right, you have more young women broadening their horizons, gaining more freedom, gaining more economic independence from gaining salaries of their own, right? So cities of 250,000 added 8 million, according to Moss in his book on the 20th century in the US during the 20s. Okay. World War I, 1 million girls were employed in one way or another, largely connected to the war effort during World War I. And so something to think about, right? Getting out of the house, earning their own salary, working and being able to fraternize with other young women. Popular culture, the jazz culture, right? You could find many sources in the media, newspapers, magazines, news clippings, etc., contending, right? And not to mention popular writers, your F. Scott Fitzgerald, your Lost Generation writers during the 20s, right? T.S. Eliot, who were writing about how wild and loose the youth culture became during the 1920s. And that a lot of it was manifested, right? Not necessarily in any way caused by it, but it was demonstrated, it was manifested by way of the jazz movement that just took the country by storm. So of course you're going to have dance halls and concerts and etc., in which you're going to have integrated um, uh, crowds where black and white young kids could dance together, right? Jazz music, remember, just adding to the controversy, is largely considered in the standard narrative as an African American subculture creation. Okay, so it was connected to black people, and so Adolf Hitler in Germany, he forbade jazz music, and crushed down on his youth jazz movement there in Nazi Germany. So you have jazz music, right? Hollywood. You have people, right, like Louise Brooks and others who they played the femme fatale, the unapologetic femme fatale on the Hollywood screen. They broke men's hearts. They slept with whatever and however many men they wanted to, and they defied the sexual double standard, right? That men could sleep around but women can't, and they were unapologetic about it, right? And then, not to mention, just in the press, many of those in Hollywood were living that lifestyle of the image they were projecting on the big screen. So Hollywood may have been influential in all of this, right? Not to mention they had a symbolic, just like jazz was a way in which they physically manifested supposedly this new youth spirit of the 20s, but also you had an image for it as well, and that was the flapper attire, right? Coco de Chanel came up with the flapper outfit in Paris, France, and here in America, they went from silk to rayon and other much cheaper fabric and made the dress and outfit much more affordable to the common working class young girl, unmarried girl who was working and gaining a salary. The written word, like I said, you have in some cases, right, it was seen as it was meant to be a criticism of their own environment, of their own time period, at least partially a criticism. F. Scott Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot. There was also a gentleman named H.L. Mencken. And H.L. Mencken was an iconoclast. He went after everything America held sacred, but he also made fun of the American culture and population and the youth as well, right? Tore into them for being very superficial, not having much substance to what they were living for, that they were, kind of conveying that image of the Roaring Twenties, that their lifestyles were a bit wild and frivolous and superficial, right? And consumer oriented. And so you had Lois Long, who wrote for the New Yorker and had a regular column, and she would write about the nightlife in particular for women in New York. And in order to, gain expertise, you might say, on the subject, to give her command of her columns, she lived that life, and she was unapologetic about it in her writings. And she would tell young ladies where good clubs were to meet, a lot of young, handsome men. And so she really kind of, propagated that image that lifestyle was alive and well, and that she was embracing it. And she certainly wasn't ashamed of doing so, right? Colleges opening for women. You have before the Civil War, Oberlin, Wellesley, Bryn Mawr. And so in the 20s, right, college attendance went up threefold, and membership for young women was just a tiny single digit at the turn of the century, to almost half of college students by the end of the 20s were women. So hence, to play catch up that dramatically, more young women, I believe it's safe to infer, went to college in the 20s than young men. And so now they're gaining that collegiate education. So for one, right, you have this postponement of adulthood responsibilities and identity, what we call, right, in multiple social sciences, adolescence. There hadn't been much of a notion, even the use of that term, adolescence, throughout much of American history up to this point. You go back to your colonial time period, right? There's a drastic dichotomy between being treated and have the lack of responsibilities of a child to suddenly having the full-blown responsibilities of an adult. And so marriages, right? were postponed. So the average rate of marriages, or the age of marriages, greatly increased to a higher age. The number or percentage of marriages plummeted. So you have now a kind of a publicly obvious, salient population of young unmarried and even middle-aged unmarried women. And believe it or not, that was seen to be scandalous, right? Because according to old puritanical notions, right, a woman, her identity was absolutely um, mixed up with and inextricably linked with being a mom, right? Marrying early and producing children. And so now, right, during this adolescent stage, that's the beginning of the modern, it is alive and well today, right? The notion of like going and living in a dorm at a 4-year college, being a time to discover who you are, sow your wild oats, right? Postpone those adulthood responsibilities for 4 years. And so you had a lot of publicity about the reality, the alleged reality of that with the college age kids, right? Then, of course, within their curriculum and within popular culture and from the press and different institutions, is you had the what some people would say the misuse and exploitation of Freud's writings, right? Because remember with Freud, I'm going real far back as far as happened to read him in school, but from what I understand and I think I recall is, he wanted a balance, some semblance of balance, and no excess, right? Regarding allegedly the balance of your id, your ID, right, which is your natural appetite. So a child, right, can walk into a restaurant and see food on a stranger's plate and maybe try to grab it off his or her plate, not knowing any better and not yet having had the super ego, the mom and dad voice, right? That is to become internalized, to be your voice of conscience, right? To tell you, no, society frowns upon that. No, there will be a negative result or consequence of that action, right? And has you, is supposed to be the parental figure that is internalized into your brain after you are reared by your parents. And so, as far as a superego trying to regulate your conduct and the id wanting to go wild, during the 20s, right, you see a lot of emphasis, perhaps overemphasis to the extent of distorting Freud's message and claiming that it is an ultimate tragedy and ultimate danger for you to not sufficiently give into your id. That you, and of course, remember, they use terms in psychology like repression, right? That you repress your impulses. You don't go and indulge adequately into all the different stages of development, right? The phallic stage, the anal stage, etc., the oral stage. That it'll have harmful consequences when you become an adult, and it'll manifest itself in different types of neurotic behaviors and psychological ailments that you'll have later in life. So you see that kind of simplification of Freud in the 20s, at least with pop culture. I can't attest to what was being taught in the universities. I'm not well read at all on that particular micro subject, but like I said, they usually say in the standard narrative that Freud was kind of distorted it in the 20s to just kind of give license to hedonism, that you need to give into your id or else there'll be negative consequences. They also were taught, and to a certain extent, right, postmodernism. Remember, postmodernism adheres to the relativity of truth, that there is no absolute truth, including absolute right and wrong with your normative behavior and your values, right, your moral values, but that everything is relative to who your socializing agents are, what time period you're in, what the institutions like schools and families are set up to be like, etc. And so postmodernism, some people blamed. And then, of course, what I should have put on here also were the different facets of Charles Darwin's writings, right? That were sometimes, again, perhaps distorted and hyperly used during the 20s. And so exospecies evolution, the idea, right, that his theory suggesting that we may have evolved outside of our own species, right? From a primate antecedent ancestor. And so that directly is in conflict with the account of Genesis in the Bible, right? With our Judeo-Christian roots historically in this country, and quote, Western Civ for that matter. That's going to challenge that notion. And so, okay, if then it's not true that Adam and Eve, the whole story of Adam and Eve and the difference and the dominion that God gave man over the animals, and now we're no different from the animals. And, you're still a little bit far away from the popularity of the Big Bang Theory and all that, but it definitely was feared by conservatives that you're going to go on a slippery slope and say, well, I don't believe anything in the Bible then, and I don't necessarily perhaps believe in the God of the Bible, and hence I don't believe in his absolute moral standards. And so, you have fear outside of religion. You have writers, right, amongst the Greeks and the Romans and others. Our founding fathers quoted many of them, stating that any society can only exercise and respect as much liberty as the people are willing to responsibly practice. That as soon as in large numbers people began abusing that freedom, right, with licentiousness, with hedonism, that you're going to have lots of societal problems and issues that will be triggered from that. So Freud, postmodernism, and then there was a couple, a sociological couple who traveled to Muncie, Indiana, to travel and look into the young kids, particularly the college age and adolescent kids, right? To try to gauge what their subculture was like, what their behavior was like, their outlook, all that, right? Their worldview, values. And of course, their findings, their alleged discoveries from their data, which largely was through interviews, right? And polls and having them fill out questions, answer questions, etc. The data, the results alarmed the conservative part of the country. They found that over half the young women that were asked if they had lost their virginity before marriage had done so. And remember, it's so hard to gauge that. You look at Puritan New England, and you have evidence of people getting married only 4 months later having a child, right? So obviously they'd had premarital sex and they had a shotgun wedding and tried to hide it, and then quickly thereafter had a child. The Victorian age, no different. And so certainly, right, you've always had your double standards and your hypocrisy, etc., and human frailty. But at least it was more hidden, right? Allegedly, and not kind of publicly flaunted, said the conservatives. And also, of course, which is more argumentative as far as its truth, is they contended that it was higher in percentage amongst the population. All right. So those are just some things I'm throwing out there. Another thing that I know it sounds perhaps simplistically silly, but I may have put on here also, was simply the automobile. A lot of people during the 1920s blamed the automobile on the woman being able to have all this freedom, this geographical freedom of movement. And so go your own direction by all means. I'm just trying to throw ideas toward you. All right. So are there any questions or comments on number 1? Okay, number 2, the Harlem Renaissance, right? So largely, right, the Harlem Renaissance is tied to a few things. One, 1905, you had the development of the NAACP with W.E.B. Du Bois and others, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they fought for integration by way of fighting for the rights primarily through the court system, right? To have trial cases to challenge different Jim Crow laws and try to win in the courts. That was their primary method, arguably. But they did a myriad of other things, including having these intellectual competitions and artistic competitions that they had at the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. And Langston Hughes, for instance, right, with his writings, was a big initial winner, and he became a star after winning a prize for an NAACP literary contest. So you have that. You also have the Great Migration during World War I. Like 1.5 million African Americans moved from the South up into the northern cities, primarily cities like Detroit, Michigan. And so when they move into these areas, right, the idea is that they're no longer under Jim Crow, right? They also form very strong ethnic enclaves. Remember, an enclave is like Chinatown, an ethnically homogenous area of a city, whereby all the basic needs and most desires are met by people of that same ethnicity, right? So you have your barbers, your barber shops, your schools, your doctors and hospitals, etc., right? That all your basic needs are met within your own community. And so that this gave them a collective, kind of enhancement of their expectations and of their collective and individual self-esteem as African Americans. Not to mention the states in the North happen to take on issues and take on the color line issue, as they called it, right? You also had Carl Van Vechten wrote a book called Inward Heaven, and it was kind of like an Uncle Tom's Cabin, if you will, showing the harsh conditions and the psychological torment that a young Black man has to go through in the inner city, poverty-stricken areas of the country. And so that was a big seller. And so then you also had Bessie Smith come out with a couple songs that just took the nation by storm as a Black woman. And then that coincided with radio, NBC, and these radio waves getting across the country, playing on the phonographs now available, right? So African-American music suddenly took the white country by storm, arguably. And then so those are a lot of the basic parts to the narrative of the origin, right? The beginning of this Harlem Renaissance. And so again, largely through the help of the NAACP and other organizations, there was an encouragement for people to come to Harlem, New York, right? To realize the American dream, to become famous and make a name for themselves, etc. And also there was a musical called Shuffle Along that really grabbed white America's attention. So in the Harlem Renaissance, you had sculpting, painting, of course, you had jazz music and singing and dancing, right? You had poetry, novel writing. So you had a myriad of different, arts that flourished by way of African-American genius and artistic expression. And so this happened in the 20s, right? So popularity, exposure, right? They say that advertisement came of age during the 1920s and just mass communication by way of the radio, especially during the 20s. So did this really help the Harlem Renaissance gain a sense of respect and recognition from the rest of the country? And so not to mention the popularity of certain individuals. Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, some of the singers, Paul Robeson, right? Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and then of course, a very popular Black female entertainer, Josephine Baker, just took the country by storm, traveling, singing, dancing, and entertaining as a Black woman. And so, to what extent do you see any evidence of that? But take a look also, which I don't have the data readily here, but you may even want to look as far as if you choose number 2. All right, is there any evidence of any legislation that comes about in the 1920s and any of the Jim Crow laws? Is anything really changed, right? And then, of course, I have that as the next one. To what extent did racial discriminatory laws in the states at the federal level remain despite the Harlem Renaissance? And so Josephine Baker, I have her down here, right? Because when she traveled and performed in several places, she was not allowed to eat or stay at the hotel in the city and location where she was about to entertain. She entertained largely for segregated audiences. And supposedly not just her marriage to a French gentleman, but also her disgust with the racism that she incurred, supposedly played a part in her decision I guess repatriate is to go back. She hadn't been there to begin with, but to leave this country and live in France. All right. Let's see here. The KKK sadly had a strong resurgence in the 1920s. You look at its membership, it was down to the tens of thousands as far as those legally registered. And it got up over 1 million by the mid 20s. And so the KKK, and what's scary, right, is it was very strong in the old Midwest, which is in the North, in northern states like Indiana. Indianapolis, Indiana was terrible and had a lot of high-ranking KKK members and leaders in that city up in the far north. You also have immigration legislation that shows Congress's kind of a xenophobia, right? Their hateful fear of things that are outside of their own demographic and their own norm, right? And so you had it culminated in a law that stated that you could have, what was it, only 10% of however many people from your country had been registered in 1890. And of course, remember the 1890s, just after 1890 is when you had a lot of immigrants who were generically called new immigrants because they were not WASP. They were from Southern and Eastern Europe, right? And so that clearly was a part of their plan with this immigration law, was to keep out new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then Claude McKay, right? Claude McKay had a poem entitled "If We Must Die," and I would encourage you to look that up. And it basically is a loose paraphrase, but at the end he says, "Those cowards have our back against the wall, and they're going to slay us all. So I, for myself, am going to go down swinging, right? I'm going to die fighting." He ends his poem with. And so clearly, right, you see evidence of antagonism. You have the movement. You could look at Harlem itself, and there was a movement by key educated middle class African American leaders who were trying to work with real estate to develop a quote respectable middle class Black contingent of that city as a suburb, right, to be established, because a lot of the working class people in the inner city were almost no better than the Southerners who suffered from the Sambo image, right? Remember that? As far as the popular stigma that was put upon them as being lazy, criminally prone, dependent upon government, the men as sexually aggressive, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a movement, right, that said, okay, if we could just show a new image of the African American, right? Not that same old Sambo image, that same sociological image of the inner city Black man, Black kid, but show this respectable, glasses wearing, college educated African American family, right? Who are responsible and successful, etc. And when you look at the movement for that, right, you find a very strong counter-racist movement to try to combat that and to keep that community from developing. And yeah, and so some, right, developed a reputation for kind of a precursor to the later Black Power movement, right, where some, calling themselves generically the new Negro, said, you know what, then if you're not ever going to accept us, then I don't think I even want to be integrated by you, white America. I'm going to be proud of being Black, and I'm going to keep myself separate as far as my identity, as far as my loyalty, right, and as far as my lifestyle. And of course, a spokesman for that was a guy named Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican who came to the States and went on a big tour trying to get African Americans to be proud of themselves, to identify and kind of seclude themselves amongst one another, amongst their own, and even move back to Africa together. Okay, at this time. Of course, the president Coolidge is going to have him deported, actually. So you definitely have experience. You have evidence of a racist backlash. And then Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen. I read something interesting about their works, and that is right is in some of their works they show the angst right of the African American of that time period who was experiencing an identity crisis, right? Whereby a part of him or her was wanting to do everything he or she could to win over the respect and the affirmation of the white society. And in doing so, right, they almost became ashamed of being Black. And whatever was associated with being Black, they tried to distance themselves from, right, in order to gain white America's acceptance. And then through the course of the novels, right, their protagonists kind of have an epiphany, if you will, whereby they kind of decide, right, and come to the sad conclusion that it doesn't matter what they do, it doesn't matter what they accomplish. White America will never get over their appearance and will never accept them. And so then there's this sort of last minute rejection of white America in a sense of, well, fine, I'm going to be proud of being Black and the heck with you, right? So I find that interesting. And not to mention Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, right? They were funded, so they didn't have to have a day-to-day job. They were funded to be able to write around the clock and to be able to sleep and eat and have quarters with a rich white woman who subsidized their work. But she also, according to their accounts, was rather autocratic with them, trying to tell them, wanting to look into their yet to be published works, to give her approval or disapproval of what they were writing, to try to manipulate the directions that they went artistically. And you definitely find a sense of resentment from both of them, especially Langston Hughes, with this white woman trying to control them. So I find it fascinating as a topic. Are there any questions on number 2? All right. So then number 3, why do you think prohibition failed? For one, right, you could find evidence to suggest that maybe it was not even ever really popularly espoused by the average American to begin with, for the 18th Amendment ever to have been passed. For one, what I had recently read is the state legislators, all the way up into 1920, their representation was pretty poor as far as having, right, you look at like the Constitution, there's to be one congressional rep in the House for every 30,000 civilians. It's to be based on numbers, right? So that there is a direct representative who's directly elected by a certain number of people in a given district. Well, there were quite a few, quote, rotten districts. There were cases of agrarian areas that were not very popularly, inhabited, not a lot of people, that had as many or more representatives in their state legislature as had the huge population-oriented cities. And some of that was just not changing with the times, right? Because the cities were just blowing up in numbers the first couple decades of the 1900s, and they were not changing representation accordingly to adapt to that reality. And so some people would say that it passing the required 3/4 of the states, right, 36 states saying yes and ratifying this amendment, that several of those 36 were not the state legislator that approved it was not representative of the majority of especially the urban oriented people, right? So hence they didn't really have a voice, and this was not necessarily, the result of a popular mandate from the people themselves to issue it to begin with. And then, of course, right, you look at enforcement. Congress only gave $2 million. which of course was much more back then, but even by their standards then, that was nowhere near enough to enforce a nationwide prohibition of alcohol. Only 1,500 agents. And then, of course, they used the concurrent powers clause and stated, right, that the states needed to help them. 5 states said no. Several mayors, the mayor of Chicago, in an instance that got a lot of publicity, said no, he was not going to enforce prohibition in his city. And so it's fascinating looking at this. You look at the thousands of miles of coastline that had to be covered, and you see how weakly enforced the Canadian border was. And you had a famous highway coming from Eastern Canada down into Detroit, Michigan, and was supposedly very, very porous, right? According to a source I read, 1 out of 10 National Guard members were reprimanded and removed from their post for accepting a bribe and turning a blind eye to alcohol going by, right? So you had corruption, and you can imagine how often that happened, especially in infamous cities like Chicago, with the municipal or city policemen, right, and police departments. And so, for one, they say enforcement was very, very feeble to enforce this. The economy, there were lobbyist power. There was a lot of lobbyist strength from arguably the alcohol producers. In particular, right, the German brewers, Pabst, Budweiser, etc. Right, they were constantly taking money from their yearly budgets to bribe congressmen and to do other things to try to manipulate the maintenance of their ability to continue to sell alcohol to as many people as possible. Then there's culture, right? A lot of people call the 1920s popular culture a culture of deviance, right? Like from or sociology, right? That you deviate from, you go the left or right, you go a different direction from the manner in which you were socialized as a child, when you were taught by your parents, your religious and educational authorities, what's right, what's wrong, what's proper and improper behavior, that it may have arguably been popular to deviate from that during the 1920s. And then you have your proverbial Catholic minority groups, right? Particularly the Italians and the Irish, the German Bavarians and other groups that were very large in numbers in big cities. And of course, right, it was part of their culture. It was interlaced with their culture, not to mention with the Catholic Church, right? Very much more permissive of alcoholic consumption. Of course, moderately, right? But nevertheless, of wine in particular. I mean, after all, right, it's the part of the Eucharist during Mass. And so the Catholics tended to be wets, as they were called during that time period. And it would seem to be more of the anti, or not anti, but the non-traditional Protestants that were hardcore dries, right? The traditional ones were like the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians. But amongst, the Baptists, the Methodists, I'm not so sure of. For sure, the Pentecostals and other groups, right? A lot of them were pretty hardcore against alcohol, dries. And so, to what extent, especially in the big cities, did culture, kind of go against the success of prohibition? And so that was kind of weak what I provided there, and I apologize. I'm sure you could find more intelligent data to support your claim, but why? Why do you think prohibition failed? Okay. Then number 4, the traditionalists. Like I said, you have writers like T.S. Eliot, H.L. Mencken, F. Scott Fitzgerald that do not really, in many cases, even remotely fit the label of traditionalists. They were not religious. Matter of fact, like especially Mencken made fun of American Christians in a lot of his writings, etc. But nevertheless, they too decried, right, that this new urban-oriented, youth-oriented generation of the 20s was going wild, and that they were becoming hyper-consumerist, right? And remember when I say hyper, right? Is again going back to like the Puritan heritage from your 101 class, etc., right? It was seen as a sin to be extravagant. William Penn in Pennsylvania, he made it a crime to literally ostentatiously buy things, fancy machinery, horse carriages, etc. They could fine you for buying something just gaudily um, expensive and ostentatious, just to show off your wealth, right? Um, that was seen to be sinful. Also, frugality, right, was a part of the writings of Benjamin Franklin and others who would write like these self-help writings for the population, telling them how to get ahead in life. And they would say, right, that you need to be frugal with your spending. But now in the 20s, right, you find a very different um, notion of necessity, right? Do you really need a refrigerator, um, a stove, right? An automobile, a radio, a movie ticket, that nice attire, clothing, right? And of course, that's a rhetorical question. You don't, as far as your survival in the technical term of economics, right? But people were going crazy with consumerism, arguably during the 1920s. And like I said, especially with the great challenge with Darwinism and postmodernism, et cetera, against Christianity, uh, other you have writers of the quote lost generation of intellectuals during the 20s who contended that nothing filled that vacuum, nothing worthwhile filled the vacuum of kind of pushing aside Christianity, as far as perhaps what's the word I'm thinking of, like ontological questions, like what's the meaning of life, what's my purpose, why am I here, right? And so they felt like a typical um, F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, that the average American was thinking nothing of that depth, of that sort, but was just living for the moment, living for the day, living for pleasure, and self gratification. And so at any rate, and then you also had those prior to the 1950s, when you have a big book on this topic. It was already, that idea was already alive in the 20s, that everybody was becoming a cog in the big industrial wheel, and we were all puppets of the corporations, right? And of the money interests that were really running everything. And so you had that contention also, right? With the domination of corporations and big money in America. All right. And by the way, you see there at the bottom of this section, the Scopes trial that happened in Dayton, Tennessee, and the ACLU, right, the American Civil Liberties Union, took on a case in which John T. Scopes was fired from his job in Tennessee for teaching the theory of macrospecies evolution to his high school biology students, because Tennessee had made a law, right, against that. And so instead of it being, instead of it adhering to the basic principles that arguably should have underlied that trial, like mainly autonomy over educational curriculum, right? Who ought to decide at the K through 12 level? To what extent should the parents decide as taxpayers, right? Through the PTA, etc. To what extent should the administrators decide, right? The principal, the superintendent, the school board, right? Or the state legislator, for that matter. And then, of course, you have the issue of academic freedom, right? You have the freedom of the students to not have someone try to cram dogma down their throats, right, and indoctrinate them, but to freely ask questions and freely pursue data wherever it goes, right? But you also have the academic freedom of the teachers and the professors, right? And so instead of adhering to those things, right, it became this religious fiasco when the trial erupted. Um, a very circus-like atmosphere developed in the city of Dayton itself, as publicists and journalists flocked to that city, um, and they got in arguments over the Bible, right? Clarence Darrow put William Jennings Bryan on the on the bench and basically asked him, do you believe that Jonah was really swallowed by a great fish? Do you believe God created the world in just 6 days, etc.? And it became like this religious war, and it took on this kind of surreal atmosphere and mood. And so the local area there and the local judge, right, as you might guess, stuck to their guns with the local law, and they continue to insist that Mr. Scopes be fired, and that they could uphold that law against the teaching of macrospecies evolution to the high school biology public school students. But the liberals claim that they won in the press as far as depicting the people of that city and the people who made that law as being dogmatic, backward country bumpkins. All right. And so very, very interesting stuff in the 20s. Lots of drama, according, to the sources about this culture war, if you will. Any questions? All right. And then lastly, to what extent did hedonism or irresponsible decision making or behavior during the Roaring '20s contribute to the Great Depression? So, for one, were Americans just spending themselves into debt? So, the gross domestic product, the value of all products produced in the country in a given year, went up by 40% per capita. That's per person. So, that's averaging per person, right? Per capita income went up 30%. So Americans, by and large, have more disposable money, extra money after they pay their bills to engage in discretionary buying. But advertisement, you look in our textbook, and a lot of people contend that advertisement became very manipulatively successful in the 20s. I remember looking at one primary source, and it had a woman, right? And she did not have her makeup on, and her hair was knotted up, and a handsome, well-dressed man walks by her window and looks in and sees her. And it basically says, right, it appeals to this kind of, instinctive, visceral fear that she just lost the man of her life, that he could have been meant to be her husband and the love of her life, but she wasn't prepared and adorned for him to see her. And it was, of course, for makeup, the ad. And so they really put it on as far as their attempt to galvanize, to almost produce a demand for people to buy these things. What you see to this day, right? Promoting movie stars and professional athletes, right? And these celebrities, and trying to convey the subliminal image, right? That you too will be a rock star. You too will have this great sense of prestige and honor if you buy and use our product, right? And then, of course, a lot of the, like with smoking and cigarettes, for instance, right? A lot of sexual innuendo in the 20s ads, right? Using the phallic symbol, using things of virility for men and sexual appeal of women, et cetera, et cetera. And so you find that at this time period. So household appliances, furniture, beauty products, cars, radios, movie theaters. So look at this. According to Adolf Berle, by 1929, 80% of families had no savings by the end of the 20s. 25 to 29, the money owed on credit nearly tripled, as 80% of radios and three-fifths of cars were bought on credit, right? In quote, installment payments, as they called it. Henry Ford, it was $5 a month for a $300 and something car. So at any rate, right, to what extent were Americans, just spending themselves into debt and getting rid of all their discretionary income plus more, right, through these installment programs, buying things on credit that was arguably abused during the 1920s. Corporate greed, right? You have Republican policies under Harding, Coolidge, and then Hoover. Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, was kind of a trickle down guy, right? Who stated that not only did he not want to punish people for their success, he thought it immoral to tax wealthy corporations, etc. Because to him, right, the whole rugged individualism, Horatio Algier stuff, that like Rockefeller and Carnegie on number 4 of the Gilded Age assignment, that they had somehow earned that, and they shouldn't be punished for their success, but also for a practical reason, right? And the idea is you allow them to keep their revenue, right, and not tax it from them. They will use that additional money in a shrewd way, as they had in the past, to get to where they were, right? That they're not just going to spend it on a couple of yachts and then a couple trips to Europe. But he said that they had formed the type of habits in which they are going to further develop their businesses. They're going to spend on more machinery. They're going to open new plants, right? They're going to engage in research and development to try to give themselves a competitive edge with that extra money that they can now hold on to, right? And the idea is, in doing those things and opening new plants, they're going to hire more workers and the construction crew to construct the plants, and buying more machines. They're buying it from the machine makers, and they're going to have to hire, on the spot kind of engineers to maintain the machines, right? And the list goes on, right? Research and development. They're going to hire more intellectuals from the universities and give them salaries to engage in research and development, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is that it'll trickle down with these diminished tax rates and taxes. And J.P. Morgan boasted that his lawyers' knowledge of the laws and the loopholes thereof, right, enabled him to hardly pay a cent in taxes. And he was boasting about that, and that didn't go over well with the public. So violations of antitrust laws. They allowed different industries to, quote, cooperate, to get together and to share with one another their labor saving, their time saving, their money saving techniques, and producing things in higher quantity and in quicker time. But some of these big corporations, they utilize that opportunity to cooperate to make secret deals with each other, and hence we're clearly violating the antitrust laws. And the Republican administration seemed to do nothing about it. And then there was discouragement through multiple avenues of expression of unionization. You had the open shop plan from a lot of big corporations, whereby they stated, right, that our workers have the right to work in an open shop and to compromise with us and make deals with us on an individual basis. And they should not be bullied into joining a union. But to a lot of people, that was a euphemism for saying we don't want them to become strong as a union. And so they would actually, in some cases, fire you for even trying to start a union or join a union, etc. And so, all this is part of the common narrative leading to the Great Depression. So look at this. According to Adolf Berle, 1929, 200 corporations controlled nearly 1/2 of American industry. So concentration, right? Or as they call it, horizontal integration, taking over your competitors in an entire industry from 1919 to 28. There were 1,200 mergers, and those mergers, right, oftentimes, if we read of Rockefeller, were oftentimes forced on the smaller guys, and they dissolved 6,000 smaller independent enterprises. And then according to the Brookings Institute, the top 1/10 of 1% owned as much in wealth and assets as the bottom 42% of the population by 1929. So again, some people believe there was not enough government regulation, and that was a poor decision by the government. And then excessive speculation. And remember, speculation, right, like the stock market, is in which you try to purchase something as an investment that is supposed to gain capital, to gain value, and then sell it for profit at a higher value. So like land speculation, right? When you know a city is going to develop, you buy the land cheaply, wait for the value to skyrocket when it begins to develop into a city, and then sell it for profit. So in the stock market, there was wild speculation, and there was no Securities and Exchange Commission yet. The SEC would become like the policeman, if you will, of the stock market. So there weren't those laws yet against bear raids and bull raids, etc. So people, right, they would start false rumors and lie about a given stock, put out a false rumor to manipulate people into buying or selling that stock. And in buying it, right, it would increase the value of that stock, right? Sometimes they would buy in large numbers under pseudonyms, under false names, these big corporate giants, right? Or billionaire giants. They would start buying up tons of the stock, right? Under these false names. And so people get the false impression that this thing is just making great profit, this commodity. And also, right, there just seem to be thousands or even millions of people globally that are buying it. And so I'm jumping on it while it's hot. And so then when everyone jumped on the bandwagon, that further increased the value of the stock. And then those big guys would secretly, suddenly in one day, sell the majority of shares, and the value would just plummet. And so everybody else holding on to their shares, now they're worth almost nothing. And so you had those cases, right? We talked about Jay Gould, Gould, who was infamous for doing stuff like that. And then let's see here. And then stocks on margin. You could borrow money to buy stock, right? And there weren't a lot of limits to that ability. So a lot of people wouldn't even put down a red cent, and they would borrow the money and buy a significant number of shares of the stock, right, on margin. And there was that heady optimism of the 20s that the stock market would just keep going up and just somehow infinitely continue to rise. And so they bargained, right, on their ability to be able to pay that loan back, because they just assumed that the value of the shares of that stock were going to increase. And for a while they did, and they got away with it, right? So you borrow $50, you get $50 worth of stock, then suddenly the value skyrockets, and now it's worth over 200. So you sell them, right? If you sell them, then they just subtract the $50 that you owe them, the stockbrokers, and the other 150 you come home with. Okay, and so that's all well and good until the Great Scare in the fall of 1929, when everybody starts panicking and selling their stock. Then the stockbrokers and the others, right, the creditors, the bankers, say, okay, guys, now you got to pay back your margin, your loan, and they didn't have it, right? There was a risk that they took during the 20s. And then real estate in the Midwest and in Florida. In Florida with real estate, there was a lot of fraudulence, of people making up names of cities, I kid you not, in Florida, and areas that were already owned by other people, and falsely selling that land to somebody who was suckered into it. And this had happened, for the duration of our country's history. We had famous cases of this in the, quote, frontier, going back to the colonial time period and early republic. But it really took off in places like Florida during the 1920s. And then the Midwest, right, in places like the panhandle of Oklahoma and other areas, right, people got greedy as far as becoming cash crop farmers. They came in and they would borrow money, a dangerous amount of money, to buy this cheap land, right? And then instead of allowing a third of their land to lay fallow, to allow the nitrogen and the other, healthy nutrients to replenish themselves, they would cultivate over 90% of their land, and they would do it over and over again. Because during the 20s also, especially the early 20s and mid 20s, Europe was still trying to rebound from World War I. And so Europe was largely buying our agricultural produce. So we knew we had a buyer, our farmers did. So they would take these dangerous loans out on cheap land in Oklahoma and other areas of the Midwest, cultivate most of their land, right? And then sell it for a profit. But then things internationally are going to change. The Ukraine and other areas of Europe rebounded, and they began feeding their own European people. and our guys' farm produce would spoil on the Florida and in the European market. We demanded reparations from World War One, right? And a lot of the countries were suffering from those reparation payments and couldn't and not to mention also we had import tariffs. So when produce came from Europe, we put false taxes on it, import taxes on it, right? To artificially enhance the price of that European produce. So people would buy American instead. Well, the Europeans retaliated and put high tariffs on their stuff. And so it made the price of our farm produce much higher in Europe, and the Europeans would tend to buy the cheaper European produced farm produce. And so for various reasons, there finally became a bust, right? It started falling apart, whereby our farmers were no longer having their stuff sold. And then when that happened, of course, right, they couldn't pay back their loans for the use of the tractor and the harvester combine, in the seed and grain and other things that they were borrowing for, right? Then also, just at the wrong time for the wheat farmers in particular, they disc their fields, right, to get the best, nitrogen rich stuff on the topsoil for the seeds, right? And right at that time, the famous dust storm happened and blew away just literally tons, just thousands and thousands of pounds of topsoil. Blew it all the way to like cities like Chicago. It was crazy, this dust storm or this dust bowl that occurred, right? And so the farmers, right, are going to have their famous exodus, most famously depicted arguably in the book Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. And so, to what extent did we do ourselves in by way of greed and or poor decisions during the 20s? All right. So are there any questions or
I
comments?
have a question.
Yeah.
So do you think that with the whole produce thing with Europe, do you think that's what kind of started everything? Was that the beginning of it?
You know what? According to what I read, it I don't know if I would. You know what? I might actually say that actually, because even during the Roaring '20s, it seems like the demographic that was suffering the most, besides of course inner city quote minority groups, were farmers. And
Okay.
and this window of this boom that they experienced was supposedly a very chronologically short window in the mid 20s. You look at evidence like through the McNary-Hagen bill and these other bills, whereby the farmers desperately lobbied to get Congress to buy their surplus produce that no one was able or willing to buy, right? And of course the Republican presidents like Coolidge vetoed that and said we're not, that would be like a handout, and we're making the farmers dependent. And it didn't work. But yeah, for a very long time, the farmers were in a precarious situation. And it absolutely, I would argue, in any major history I read of the Great Depression, is an integral part to almost any historian's thesis, is what was
Okay.
happening with the farmers, for
Because
sure.
I always heard that it was the stock market, and always
Uh-huh.
assumed that is what started the Great Depression.
Yes, and I know that's a very age-old interpretation, but revisionists for at least the last 2 decades have been arguing against that and challenging that, and stating that the average American still had not even bought a single share in the stock market, and so hence that it didn't directly affect the average American. So a lot of people challenge that now, and so I would definitely say, as far as current scholarship,
Mhm.
that the phenomenon with the farmers is more often integrated as far as a major cause of the Great Depression than the
Okay.
stock market.
Okay.
But of course, though, right, when everyone's trying to sell the shares in the Great Panic of the fall of '29 of these companies, right, that greatly that adversely affected these corporations for sure. So I don't mean to downplay the fall of the stock market. It was big, but it's no longer commonly depicted as the primary reason for a lot of people. They now describe it as the most salient or most publicly observable symptom of a sick economy. And that
Okay.
was, like a fever, right?
Mhm.
The fever is not causing you to be sick. The fever is evidence that you're sick. And so hence the stock market was like the fever, right?
Okay.
Opening the eyes to us that our economy is not healthy. And then,
Okay.
of course, another factor that you're probably familiar with, Aaron, is overproduction and underconsumption.
Yes.
Is right is this vicious cycle of sales suddenly going down for the big corporations. So like uh Henry Ford, right? I have it somewhere here in my notes. I could give you the hard data later, but in one given year, he sells, right, a certain number of cars, and he increased it. He almost doubled the amount of cars for the very next year. Well, people don't buy a car every year, right?
Mhm.
And so what gave him that heady optimism that he would need, that he could sell that many more the next year, right? So
Yeah.
of course he's going to have tons of cars that are just held up in the factories and not sold, right?
Yeah.
And so then when that happens, he says, oh, I need to cut my overhead, right? I'm losing income. I need to cut my overhead. So he starts laying off workers or reducing their wages. But in doing that, right, that now you have a higher percentage of the population who's not receiving disposable income. And if they're not receiving disposable income, how are they going to buy the products that these corporations are producing, right? And so it became a vicious cycle with layoffs.
Okay.
So overproduction and underconsumption was another huge integral part to our economy, kind of metaphorically becoming sick.
Okay. I had heard about that, but I hadn't heard so much that the produce in Europe, that how we weren't selling it because
Yes.
our price was so high. I didn't know that that was a factor as well.
Yes, and I feel pretty confident from the respectability of some of the historians that I'm looking at, and like the the accolades and the attention that their books received. From that, I'm assuming, right, that there's a high level of credibility in what I've read in their works, and supposedly that is a very integral part to the Depression. Is
Okay.
that very part of it?
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Anyone else? Anyone else? All right, I'm going to quickly look here at the chat and see if I have a question by way of a chat. Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you, Ariana. And Ivy. Okay. All right. And so, okay, guys. So, if that's it, I'm finished as far as that, what I wanted to convey as far as just, suggestions, just getting your brain, getting the ball rolling in your head, as far as, any of those 5 that you decide to choose. So if that's it, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day and a week. You guys have a great day, a great week, and Canvas message me if you have any
Thank you.
questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.